An incredible back and forth and dramatic game today between Bobby Fischer and his great American rival, Samuel Reshevsky. Samuel Reshevsky was the future of American chess. As a boy, he was clearly a prodigy until Fischer came along and sort of took that mantle from him. And they had many very compelling games. This was played in a match between them in 1961 that was played partially in New York and partially in Los Angeles. Reshevsky has white. Fischer has black. Let us jump right in. d4 from Samuel Reshevsky. Knight to f6, c4, and a surprise, e6 from Bobby Fischer. Not his normal King's Indian defense. Knight to c3, d5, cd5, offering the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined, and Fischer takes with the knight, the semi-Tarrasch defense. These days, this is seen as a safe opening. It's been called sort of the Berlin defense against d4. However, at the time, I don't think it was seen quite as safe an opening as it is today. Knight to f3 from Reshevsky, c5, the standard move in these Queen Gambit lines for black to challenge white's center. e3 and knight to c6. Fischer builds on the d4 square. Bishop to d3. Reshevsky just creates a very standard attacking formation, puts the bishop on an effective diagonal. Fischer plays bishop to e7, both sides castle, and a3, keeping a piece out of b4 and maybe expanding with b4 himself later. Fischer goes ahead and takes on d4, and Reshevsky takes with the e-pawn. And we now have a very standard isolated queen's pawn position, or IQP for short. And the basic strategies are like this. What black would like to do is usually trade off minor pieces and get into a heavy piece endgame with queen and rooks against this pawn, and black can put a lot of pressure on this isolated pawn in lines like that. What white wants to do is either play d4, d5 and liquidate that pawn and allow his pieces to become very active, or if black can prevent that, he wants to use that pawn to launch an attack on black's king. Fischer plays knight to f6, putting more pressure on d4. He's not threatening to capture it just yet, because at the end of the line, white would be able to play bishop h7 check and win material, but the pressure, though, is still there. What Reshevsky does is play bishop to c2. The idea is simple. He can't quite liquidate yet, so he wants to play queen to d3, line up this bishop and queen, and aim at black's h7 square. b6, preparing to develop his last minor piece. Fischer to play bishop to b7. And now queen to d3 from Reshevsky, setting up this battery, this classic orientation of bishop and queen, aiming at the h7 square. So if this knight were to disappear, white could play queen takes h7 mate. Bishop to b7 from Fischer, and now Reshevsky plays bishop to g5 with that exact idea, to take this knight off of the board and then play queen h7 mate. So what Fischer does to deal with that is he plays g6, blunting that light square diagonal and the queen and the bishop. The problem is that he does weaken some of these dark squares around his king, and also this pawn can become vulnerable to a lever of the h-pawn, weakening it later in the game. Reshevsky plays rook f to e1. Fischer plays rook to e8, probably with the idea of bishop f8, bishop g7, to further aim at the d4 weakness. But now h4, just as we discussed. Reshevsky continues his kingside attack, and he's threatening h5, creating some weaknesses on the king side. Rook to c8 from Fischer, rook a to c1. Both sides make sure that their pieces are developed. You can tell these are strong players. If you look at, they're not launching the attack undeveloped. They both make sure all of their pieces are developed on good squares. Fischer goes back to d5 with that knight, offering the exchange of minor pieces. As we discussed earlier, the side playing against this isolated queen's pawn wants to exchange minor pieces. Fischer offers two pieces for the exchange. But white does not want to exchange minor pieces. So Reshevsky plays knight to e4. He can't avoid the exchange of this bishop, but if Fischer were to exchange that off, it would enhance the weakness of his own dark squares. So what Fischer plays is a very sort of a risky move, actually. He plays f5. Now, this does put an end to all of this, any potential activity along this diagonal. But it does create new weaknesses, particularly the e6 pawn and the e5 square. But White does have to reorient himself to a different approach to the game. That's the one advantage, and also it weakens Black's king quite a bit. So a risky decision from Fischer. The knight goes back to c3. Now he does go ahead and grab on g5. Knight takes g5, but he had a very specific idea in mind when he took that bishop. This move, knight to f4. Not only does he hit the queen, but he's also putting some pressure on this g2 pawn, which works very well with this bishop on b7, which also aims at this g2 pawn. Now, a modern computer showed the best move for white here would be queen to f3, basically creating a pin on this knight. I mean, the knight could move, to a5, but then this knight would be lost. And if Fischer grabs the d pawn, then after rook cd1, Reshevsky would have far too much counterplay. But the idea of putting your queen opposite this bishop is still kind of scary. So Reshevsky plays a much more natural-looking move, queen to e3, not only threatening the knight, but also lining up against this weak pawn at e6. But Fischer goes ahead and takes the pawn at d4. Goes ahead, grabs that material, and tries to defend this position. But Reshevsky's calculation in the next few moves is absolutely incredible. He really outcalculates Fischer in these next few moves. First he plays knight to b5, hitting the queen. Queen takes e3. Now it would be a mistake for Reshevsky to take on e3 with the rook, because then Fischer could give up that knight, opening up this diagonal, and after king g2, knight to d4 check, double check, king h3, then knight takes b5, and after grabbing on e6, we could see that Fischer would be up an entire pawn here. So instead of taking with the rook, Reshevsky takes with the pawn. That also gains a tempo against the knight at f4. Then Fischer does take on g2, and this is where Reshevsky outmaneuvers Fischer. He takes on g2, and then knight to d4 check, a discovery against the king, and also an attack on this b5 knight. But Reshevsky's next move is quite shocking and quite brilliant. He must have seen this ahead of time. He plays bishop to e4, a move that looks impossible at first sight, but is very strong. If Fischer takes with the pawn, then knight takes on d4, and Reshevsky's just up an entire minor piece. So bishop takes e4 with check is played. Knight takes e4. Now in this position of fe4, again, knight takes d4, and Reshevsky would still be up a piece. And you see Reshevsky's knight is threatening a check on f6. That's really the stinger at the end of the scorpion's tail in this calculation from Reshevsky. So knight takes b5, and now knight to f6 check. And Reshevsky's going to get an exchange. King to f7, knight takes e8, rook takes e8. And after a very complicated series of complications, the dust is settled a bit. Looking at this position, we can see Fischer does have two pawns for the exchange, that's sufficient material. And his pawns are healthy and strong. But if Reshevsky can find a way to activate these two rooks into Fischer's position, Bobby Fischer is going to be in some trouble. So it's going to be a real fight here. First of all, Reshevsky wants access to this c7 square. So he plays a4 to dislodge this knight, which protects that square. The knight goes to d6, rook to c7 check, king to f6. Now, it would be a mistake for Reshevsky to go pawn grabbing here. Let's say he takes on a7. Fischer could play rook to c8. And now the threats of rook to c2 along with knight to e4 give him sufficient activity to fight back. So instead, Reshevsky goes ahead and doubles on the c-file. Now when he moves this rook, he'll be in control of the file. Fischer begins to get his pawns moving with h6. Maybe a5, saving that a-pawn for the time being, was more accurate. But he knows that if he wants to win, he's going to have to do it with his kingside pawns. Now Reshevsky can grab this pawn at a7 because this file is controlled by his rook. Fischer plays knight to e4, clearly the best square for the knight. Rook to a6, attacking Fischer's b6 pawn. And now rook to d8. Fischer doesn't worry about this pawn. He puts all of his stock in the activity of his pieces. He wants to play rook to d2 check and cause some trouble for Reshevsky. So Reshevsky plays rook to c2 to control that entry square, to keep the rook from getting in. But Fischer plays rook to d3 instead, attacking the e-pawn. Reshevsky goes ahead and takes that b6 pawn, and then rook takes e3. And we see this a pawn from Reshevsky is very quick, very fast. It's going to be hard for Fischer to stop it. a5, but now f4. This is Fischer's hope to create some problems on the king side. For Reshevsky, his f pawn looks pretty fast too. Here, Reshevsky plays rook to f2, giving back the exchange. As it turns out, the move king to f1 keeps the advantage. A very hard move to see. Knight to g3 check looks really strong, but after king to g2, he's controlling this f3 square. The pawn were to advance, he would take the knight. And after the knight moves back, just rook to b4, basically offering the exchange back and creating a winning rook versus rook endgame. If the pawn advances king to f1, f2, then just rook takes e2. And after knight g3 check, forking, king would take the pawn, rook takes, and king takes knight. And this endgame is easily winning for white. So that king to f1 move was actually the way to go forward. But again, very hard to see. Instead, he plays rook to f2, giving back the exchange, believing that his pawns on the queen side are too fast for Fischer to stop in a rook endgame. Fischer does go ahead and take that rook. King f2, now rook to e5, directly attacking the a-pawn. b4 defends it, and now the rook goes back to e3. We know that rooks belong behind passed pawns in endgames. Whether you're defending or attacking, the rooks belong behind the pawns. a6 from Reshevsky, rook to a3. And here Reshevsky makes what is really imperceptible, but is a critical error. The correct move here is b5, keeping these pawns intact and defending this pawn at a6. And after g5, hg5, hg5, Reshevsky can play rook to b8 and move his own rook behind these pawns and get his own pawns moving. What he plays instead is rook to c6. And by delaying b5 with one tempo, that's all the tempos that Bobby Fischer needs. Now he plays g5, just as we saw, but now a tempo up. hg5, hg5 check. Now b5, and we see black is threatening to play g4 and then check, which would force the king, the white king, to the back rank. Which he does, he plays g4. Now rook to c8, but a tempo behind. King to f5. Threatening to get his king in and using these two pawns along with the rook to deliver mating threats. And if a rook to f8 check, he would just play king to e4. So b6 from Reshevsky. g3 check, king to e1. Rook to a1 check, king to e2, and g2. Fischer is one move away from queening. What can Reshevsky do to deal with this problem? Well, first he checks. Then king to e4. And Reshevsky does the best he can, but because of that loss of tempo, white is lost. If he plays b7, then just rook to a2 check, forces the king to the back rank, and Fischer would promote to a queen with checkmate. So what Reshevsky does is play rook takes f4 check first. King takes f4, now b7, threatening to queen, but allowing Fischer to queen, which he does. But then Reshevsky queens with check. So his hope is that he can get a perpetual, that he'll be able to check this king forever, and Fischer will not be able to stop those checks with these two pieces of his. King to f5, queen to f8 check. Fischer has to find a way to hide from the checks. King e4, queen to a8 check. King to d4, queen to d8 check. King to c4, queen to d3 check. King to c5. Does Reshevsky have a perpetual check? Queen to c3 check, king to d6. The queen goes to d2 with check. The king goes to e5. Queen to b2 check. If he goes to c3, then queen to d4. And the only other check, queen to g3, step aside. And then queen to c4 would force the queens off the board. And that would be winning. So he plays queen to b2 check. And Fischer plays king to f5. And in this position, Reshevsky, seeing the writing on the wall, resigns. But let's look at the next few moves to make sure we can see how Fischer avoids the checks. After queen to c2 check, king to f6, queen to c3 check, he can play e5. and the checks are beginning to disappear. If queen to f3, then Fischer could play king to g5. And you'll notice there's no place for the queen to deliver check that doesn't involve it being traded off for black's queen. But if instead queen to c6 check, the same move, king to g5. And in this position, Reshevsky has run out of checks. I mean, he could check here, obviously, but he would just lose his queen. A very dramatic game, a back and forth, brilliant calculations from both sides, decided by a painful inaccuracy in the endgame. Chess at its highest level. I hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.